first. This psalm does that in a number of certain ways. In his commentary on the Old Testament, it was written by two men, Keil and Delitzsch, Germans. In Delitzsch's commentary on the psalm, he wrote, and I like the way he put this, he says it begins with a deep sigh. You can kind of see that in verses 1 and 2. There's a deep sort of, like when you take a big heavy sigh and then your spouse asks you, what's wrong? And you say, nothing. It's always false, right? That's kind of how it begins, with a deep problem. And then by a prayer, and then it concludes in joy. So you can see that progression as you move through. And I like this thought too by another writer, Broyles, much more close to us in time. He wrote that the psalm, in expressing a complaint, need not indicate a lack of trust. In short, to state that there's a problem doesn't mean you don't have trust in God that He has the solution. You still have every right to say there's a problem here, and I need God to solve it. And trusting in God doesn't make the fact that you need to complain, it doesn't make that moot. It doesn't remove your need to say something about it. It's like one of those, some people believe, well, if I trust God, then I'm never allowed to say what I feel. And that's not true either. The psalm has both of them. And it helps us with processing that stuff. All right. What do you notice? What do you see? When you had a chance, Lord will, hopefully, to look at it before now, what caught your eye as you read through? We mentioned one of them, the repetition in verses 1 and 2. That's a big detail, but what do you think?
I think the point you just made, sometimes we get down. Some people, I've heard people act like it is sinful to be discouraged or depressed. Sometimes we get down. Sometimes life is hard, and sometimes you need help, and it's okay. It doesn't mean you're not a good Christian.
Yeah, sometimes you need to say so. You need to put that out there. This is not going well. This is bad, right? And the Psalms do that repeatedly, and this is one of the more sort of intense examples of that. All right, Bob?
I thought it was interesting. I looked at several commentators. One, Matthew Henry, talked about the complaining. And I thought it was interesting. The point he made was complaining's fine, but perhaps a better way to approach it would be to offer it in prayer to God, asking for solutions to yours as opposed to.
There's a proper avenue.
There's an avenue, and I thought it was an excellent point.
It is a good one.
Because, too often we just, we want to grouse and gripe and so on and so forth, but it's like, Lord, I'm having a rough day today. Would you please strengthen me and help me get through the day?
Yeah, we want to complain to one another, right? We don't want to direct it to proper channels, to someone that actually can help and do something about that. All right, that is a good point. And it's one of the good examples in reading a commentary that I like to say rarely is someone wrong about everything. Every so often, someone, even the commentators that are out in left field, every so often they get one right, and some more than others, and that's what makes it valuable to read those folks. Always with your salt shaker in hand. All right, I like to say, because some people need more than others. Yes.
In reading this, to me, it was the feeling of, at the beginning, it was all on David. He was looking inward, looking at his issues, and then when he decided, everybody's against me, and he started to talk to God, then he started to realize and remember who he trusted in, who God is, and God isn't going to let the wicked win over David and over God. And it just felt like there was a progression.
I like that you notice that there's a personal nature to this, and he seems to be focused on himself, right? I'll put the words back up. Which line of the psalm does he not use the word I or me or my? The only one is the heading, okay? Because the heading, believe it or not, the heading was included in the original Hebrew text of the psalm, right? It has value. We typically don't read it for that because sometimes it's like this. It doesn't say much. But the heading's the only line that doesn't say some version of I, me, or my. This is personal. Now, if you have your Bible open, look back at Psalm 12. You remember right at the end of Psalm 12, who was doing the speaking or the complaining, or on whose behalf was it done? It was us, right? So we talked about that last week. It was a community lament. Everybody kind of all together. Psalm 13 is very personal. right? Me, myself, and God are having the conversation. And you see that as you move through, okay? Other things, other stuff you notice, yeah.
I feel like this song really reminds me of what Job went through. Just during his suffering, is God even there? Everything, his family, and everything that he had was taken away, but, he doesn't forsake God, and he still knows that God is in power.
Yeah, there are huge sections of Job where he's asking, he wants to call God basically into a courtroom and have him explain himself. And that's the kind of the big problem of Job. But this psalm should remind you, I think, of two books of the Bible, and Job's one of them, right? What do you suppose would be the other one? Two places in the Bible where somebody is looking to God in the midst of a terrible situation, crying out, why is this going on? How long is this going to keep going? Give you a hint. It's actually in the name of the book.
Well, I think of Elijah.
Elijah has a similar sort of complaint. I mean, a book of the Bible in the Old Testament. It's Lamentations.
Oh,
Give you a couple of examples, right? Look, if you will, Lamentations. If you have it, it's if you can find Jeremiah, that's a big book. It's the next book after that. Okay, it's in your Old Testament. Written by Jeremiah. He gets the nickname the Weeping Prophet for a reason, because most of what he writes is very sad. He is the one that's basically allowed to stay in Jerusalem while it's being destroyed. Okay, so the capital city, the homeland, it's gone now because of Babylon. In verse 1 of Psalm 13, David asks, how long, O Lord? And then he says, will you forget me forever? Lamentations 5 and verse 20 says this. If you find that. Beginning of verse 19, but you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Same sort of complaint. David looks to God in a context that we're really not sure of, but there were plenty of moments to have this feeling, and says, are you going to forget I'm here forever? Are you going to forget that I trust you and you saved me forever? Is that really what's going to happen? Jeremiah asks the same question at the end of Lamentations on behalf of Israel, or Judah more specifically. Will you forget us forever? That phrase is not an accusation against God. It's not an implication that somehow God has forgotten. Forget in the Old Testament is different from forget right now in 2025. When we say forget, what do we mean by that? To forget something means, like me with the lessons, what does it mean? It means it's gone. It's not never in my brain, never, and whatever happens. Forget back then means I did not act on the situation, right? Kind of like now, I forgot to do it, so I didn't do the thing, right? Forget back then meant the same thing, that God didn't act to deliver, or at least not yet, right? When God remembers his people, it doesn't mean that one day he went, oh yeah, I've got this covenant people, I better go down and save them. That's never what happens. It's always God has now acted on behalf of his people, right? So it's more of an action thing, less of a thinking thing. So when you come back to the psalm, will you forget me forever? What does it mean? How long are you going to go on letting this happen? How long are you going to go on without saving me? That's the feeling of the word, okay? And I wanted to make sure I got at least one quote from Lamentations. Another place of this, there in the psalm, I think I've got it later in the notes. No, I didn't put it on there. In verse 4, when David complains in the psalm, lest my enemies say, I've prevailed over him, same feeling in Lamentations 1 and verse 16. That the enemies, in that case Babylon, has prevailed over Jerusalem, and that's the nature of the complaint. Okay. Other things you can see, just observation, kind of noticing the words and noticing connections type thing, which is what we do in the first stage. The question in verses 1 and 2, what's the question that gets repeated? How long? 4 times. It's the exact same phrase 4 times. How long, and will something happen, or will you not do something? The question's asked 20 times in the book of Psalms, and its most common is in this psalm, Psalm 13. Right? 4 times. No other psalm says it as many times as it does here. To say it 4 times in only 6 verses is a sign of intensity. Notice what he says in verse 1. How long will you hide your face from me? If you've got your Bible open to Psalm 13, look back at Psalm 11. Right? If you look back at Psalm 11, it was the psalmist David saying, "The Lord is righteous; he loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face." At the end of that psalm, David is saying, the righteous get to see you. And now here in 13, he's saying, we can't see you. You've hidden your face from us. Now, I put up here also Isaiah 59 and verse 2. There's a famous passage in Isaiah that talks about God hiding his face. He says actually, something has hidden my face from you. What is that thing? You remember? Iniquities or sins, right? In Isaiah 59, God says, your sins or your iniquities have hidden my face from you. Now, the psalm doesn't actually say it, but what might be the problem? What might be the issue that's causing David to call out like this? It might be sin. This might not be just some random evil that's happened to him. This might very well be a response of God to sin in David's life. And just like we know he was attacked and treated badly for no reason many times, there are also lots of situations where David had to suffer because of something he did, right? You think about the incident with Bathsheba. You think about him taking the census. You think about even earlier, before he becomes king, there were moments of that. That might be the scenario here. It's not certain, but it's a definite possibility. Okay, other things to notice. Verse 4, lest my enemies say, or verse 3 rather, consider and answer me, O Lord my God, light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Have you ever heard that word death being described as sleep elsewhere in the Bible?
Jesus said of the daughter, she's asleep.
Jesus used it a couple of times, right? Particularly of Jairus' daughter. She's not dead, she sleepeth, right? It says there. The phrase is used often. The first is in, or another reference to that is in Jeremiah 51. It's used a couple of times. One more of these, and then one more of these, and I want to get to one other thing. The word in verse 4 for shaken, he is upset in verse 4 because he doesn't want his enemies to rejoice because he has been shaken, or he has been, his foundations have been removed. In 10 and verse 6, it's Psalm 10 and verse 6, it was the wicked who said in his heart, I shall not be moved. Same word. The wicked in 10 and verse 6 are saying, nothing bad's ever going to happen to me. I'm standing on solid ground. In chapter 13, David is upset because he thinks his enemies are going to win, and he's going to be the one that's shaken, not them. Right? He's going to get the thing that should happen to them. Verses 5 and 6 are very interesting because of the tense of the verbs. Normally, that's never an interesting thing. I was a math major for a reason. English is not interesting. But in this case, it is, or I'll give it its credit. Did you catch that David said, I have trusted, and then I have trusted, my heart shall rejoice. And then he does it again. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully. What's he doing? He's not just saying God will save me at some point, and he's not just saying God has done good things at some point. He's using both. David is the man in the middle. And all of the suffering people, when they go through things, we are the people in the middle of that moment. Why are we complaining so much? Because we're in between what God has done and what God will do. We're in that gap. And it's in that gap where we have to decide, am I going to stick with God or am I going to try something else? Right? It's that space in between what God has done and what God will do where we have to decide who we're going to be with. And you can see here who David decided to trust. Right? In the middle of his problem. Okay. All right. them reading it in their time, what should they have done with it? What are the big takeaways? This was recorded and saved for a reason. If you look at the heading, it seems odd that a psalm like this would be something that would be suggested to the choir, to the Levite singers in the temple. You think about that? I mean, this is a downer. I mean, this is not. I mean, this isn't. This isn't Sing and Be Happy. This is Just As I Am pitched a notch low, right? This is this is bad. So then, why, of course, by God's wisdom, was this given to the Israelites to listen to as they went to temple? Right?
I think Dennis said it well. We all face things, and they all face things. And their faith may be shaken, it shouldn't be broken. And so I think this prepares them that there will be things in their daily lives, just because you're a Christian today or an Israelite then or whatever. Everything's not going to be sunshine and lollipops. There'll be things you'll face, and you need to be prepared for them.
Yep. How does Sing and Be Happy start, by the way? Anybody remember?
If the skies are gray.
And we sing that happily. If the skies above me are gray. It's like, I don't feel so great about that.
Oh, you're feeling blue, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
It admits that fact, which is one hugely valuable thing the psalm does. It says, how long are you going to forget me? How long are you going to hide your face? How long do I love verse 2, because you have done this and I have done this. How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart? When we take counsel with our soul, or when we really begin to dwell on something and begin to think about a solution, what are we expecting to happen? What would we like to happen? We want an answer. We want a way out. We want a resolution. And too often, what happens? There's that line in the Three Stooges. Curly always asks, I love it. He says, you ever try to think and nothing happens? That's verse 2. How long do I have to just keep the gears turning, and what do I get for it? Nothing. Right? Nothing happens. I don't come up with an answer. Some problems are like that. The more you think about them, just the worse it gets, because all you get is tired. Right? Yes, sir.
I think it goes along this interpretation also with the application. Maybe I'm jumping ahead some, but
They always flow one to the other, so you're fine.
it's easy, when you put yourself in these shoes, or even in their shoes. When we wrestle with our thoughts, when we get upset about our sin with ourselves, it's easy to become a victim, right? Why is this happening? Why have you hid your face from me? Where are you? Why aren't you helping me when I need you? But the reality is, in verse 6, he's been good to me.
Mm-hmm.
What rejoices in my heart, what makes my heart rejoice is your salvation. Because it's just like the same concept of the truth is what sets me free. That's what actually gives me my strength every day, because, as much as everybody gets tore up about all these things that go on in this life, I know where my citizenship is.
Yeah.
I know he's coming back, irregardless of what they do to me. But it just was interesting, because I've seen myself in that, like, kind of get burrowed in your own sorrows. Why is this going on? It's like, look at what he's done. He's been good to me.
Yeah. David makes the choice in verse 5. What will he trust? Seems like in verse 2 he's trying to trust in himself and think his way out. And he realizes that doesn't work. So he puts his trust in another basket. What is it?
Unfailing love.
God's unfailing love, his covenant love, his mercy, his grace, the word's hesed. We've heard me say that before. It's that word in the Hebrew that they were trying to describe the way God feels about his people, and it defies translation because it just covers so many different things. Right? The way God feels about Israel, the way God feels about people who search for him and long for him. That's what David is doing. Not only that, but in verse 5, when it says, I don't know what it says in yours, mine says, but I have trusted. Unfortunately, they didn't have bold print in the Hebrew. But the way that's written is actually emphatic. It's not, well, I have trusted. It's, I have trusted. I mean, it is loud. We would put that in all caps if it were written in our time. Right? That's the way David says it. It's not just, well, this is my last option, but it's like, I am defiantly trusting God. In spite of everything else. That's what I'm choosing to do. I like the way, I shamelessly stole this from somebody I read, and I thought they put it well. The result or rather the solution begins with prayer. Whatever it is. And the deeper the problem, the more intense the prayer has to get. And the way he put this is in terms of that verses 1 and 2. There are kind of three things, right? There's the relationship to God. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? There's the relationship to myself. How long do I have to take counsel in my soul? And then there's the relationship to the enemies. How long will my enemy be exalted over me? And the author I read says, look, the answer to all of those is turn to God in prayer. Right? When the issue is something I'm thinking about him or something I'm thinking about me or something about a third person, the answer is prayer, and prayer more intensely. Right? More of it always helps. This was a different author, but I thought this was good too. God's the only one who can keep bad from getting worse. Verses 1 and 2, it's bad. Right? This is not going well. Who's the only one that can keep bad from going worse? It's God. That's it. Right? You might think if you're Job, well, how could it get worse? It could have gotten worse. Right? Little did he know how much worse it could have gotten, truth be told. Jesus was a man who realized that it can always go from bad to worse. That's why he told his disciples, do not fear those who can kill the body, but rather fear the one who can destroy both. He knew that worse is possible. Even in the case of death, worse is possible. God's the only one who could prevent bad from going to worse. The people who turn to God realize that they can't trust in themselves. And often they're forced to realize that. And I think that's one thing trials do. You know, there's that thing, and I understand where it comes from. You know, God will never give you a situation beyond what you can handle. That's not in the Bible. The line is, how does it work? God will always provide a way of escape from what? Sin, temptation, right? There is always an option that does not involve sin. But when we generalize that and we say, God will never give us something we can't handle, that's false. I mean, read the Psalm again. David can't deal with whatever this situation is. He can't think his way out. He can't just be okay. He is encountered with something he cannot overcome. God does that to us sometimes to make us realize, where should our trust be? Where do our blessings come from? God led Israel into the wilderness and fed them with manna. Why? Remember why? Jesus quotes this in Matthew 4. So that Israel would realize that man was not what? Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Right? God led Israel into the wilderness to make them realize it's not about what you can do and what you can gather and what you can grow. It's about me. They forgot that lesson, as all people do. Right? The Psalm reminds us we have to keep coming back to trusting God. The only people who come out of this better are the ones who trust in God's, as it says there, His hesed, His salvation, and the ones, like Ryan pointed out at the end of the Psalm, that are able to look back and see what God has done for them already. Right? Realizing He's been there the whole time, and He's the only solution you're going to have going forward. I said this about the choir master already. Now, verse 5 still shows us that there's a choice. We have a choice. Remember that gap in the middle between what God has done and what God will do? There's that space in the middle where you still have to make a choice. Am I going to continue to trust in Him? Or maybe, am I going to trust Him for the first time? That's a choice too sometimes. We're in that moment of decision. What are we going to do? Right? Are we going to trust Him, or are we going to try something else? We have to be willing to make that choice. All right. I like this. One thing that just kept running through my brain when I read verses 5 and 6 again is He has and He will. That's just a real simple way to put that. God has done things and He will do things. God has saved, He will save. He has been merciful, He will be merciful. Right? We've mentioned this last week with Psalm 12. The question's never whether or not God will save and deliver His people. The question will be, are there going to be anybody left waiting on it? Right? Like Jesus said, will he find those with faith on the earth? All right, application stuff, and then we'll get to the connections over to Jesus. We're told pray without ceasing. We could just sort of leave it at that, but there are moments that I think demand more of it than others. Right? There are situations, there are times in which prayer has to go not from 0 to 5, but from 9 to 10, or from 8 to 10, wherever you are on the scale, sometimes to 11. Prayer should be a constant in the life of the Christian, but there are moments when it becomes more intense and more needed. I think about the way this is put in Romans 8, right? When the mention of the Spirit being the intercessor on behalf of Christians is written, we know that those who love God, all things will work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. That's an expression of God will do the best moving forward. He will deliver, He will save. It's just a New Testament analog to that same thing. Of course, we read on Sunday during our prayer service. I'm very thankful we had that. Just before, I think it was Bob's prayer for the sick of the congregation, we read from James 15, right? In a moment of distress, both spiritual and physical distress. There's sin and there's sickness, and the answer there was pray. If you're a Christian, pray in that circumstance. That thing I said about some problems are just beyond you, God will put stuff in front of you that you can't deal with. In terms of your situation, it's just Bible. Look at 2 Corinthians 1. Paul admits that to be the case. Right? 2 Corinthians 1, beginning there in verse 8, he writes to the Corinthians, the second letter, which is much more friendly than the first. He says, "We do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself." Remember that question from earlier? Will God ever give you a situation that you cannot handle? In terms of a temptation you can't overcome, there's always a way out. We know He teaches that. But in terms of a situation that is beyond your strength to be able to deal with, yes, He does. Paul said it. Paul said plainly, we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we've set our hope that He will deliver us again. Remember earlier we said in the psalm that David talks about what God has done and what God will do? Read verse 10 again. He delivered us, and He will deliver. It's the same pattern. The faithful of Paul's generation, that first generation of Christians, it's the same decision that the faithful had to make in David's time, and it's the same decision we have to make in ours. All right? To say, I trust that God, for one, did what He did in the past, and for two, is still in the business of doing that, because that's who He is. That's what He is. All right? That's the type of God He is. We still have to be called on to trust Him. Where's our confidence? It's in the same place David's confidence was. David says, I have trusted in your hesed, in your steadfast love. It's that same sort of love that Paul describes at the end of the book of Romans. Right? He says, you can probably finish the sentence. Who shall separate us, what? From the love of Christ. And then he goes through, remember that list of 7 things? Peril and distress and famine and sword. The big list of 7. 7's a good number. And then he says, look, when you look at all of it, nothing separates God's love from His people. Ever. That's the trust Paul had to have, and Paul told the Romans to have. It's the same trust we have. Our confidence is in God's love for His people. No matter what happens, even if death occurs, we're those people who say, He has and He will. And we're going to trust Him for the rest in the middle. Again, the question is not whether or not God will save and deliver His people. That's an answered question. I think the phrase is that's a solved science, right? That's a science in which there are no more questions. God will do this. The question is, are there going to be any people left waiting on it? That's our task. It's not to save ourselves. It's not to stack up so many good works that we earn our own salvation, we buy our way in. People accuse us of that, and it's just silly and false. But our task is what David's task was, is who are you going to trust in the meantime? Who are you going to obey? Right? Our task is to remain one of God's people, to be among that group of people. I think Jude puts this well. You always want to say Jude chapter whatever, but there's only one chapter, so it's always, when you're writing this, it always catches you off guard. Jude 20, the way he puts this is just before the book of Revelation. Jude says, "But you, beloved," he remembers writing to Christians, "but you, beloved, building yourselves up in your most holy faith and praying in the Holy Spirit, keep yourselves in the love of God, waiting for the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ that leads to eternal life." There's no aspect in which we earn what God's going to do. But it is our responsibility to be where God's going to do it, if that makes sense. Right? If God says, "I'm going to deliver you this way," it's our task to remain there until that point. Do we earn what He's going to do? No. Do we have to be where He's going to save? Yes. That's our task. All right. Anyway. And just thinking more about what the occasion for the psalm might have been. If it was indeed sin that caused God's face to be turned from David, we don't know that was it, but there's at least a link to that idea. Anything that threatens to hide God's face from us has to become the worst thing ever in our mind. I mean, not an irritation. It has to become like a death sentence to us. We have to be people who regard it that way. Right. So anyway, there's a thought there. Okay, what do you see in the psalm that reminds you of Jesus? There's a lot, so feel free.
Verse 1 made me think of Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yes, he does not quote Psalm 13:1. There's the same thought, though, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, bonus points, where is that from?
Psalm 22.
A little bit later in the book, same exact thought, though. And Psalm 22 is much more expressive, right, of the same thought that you see here. But that's the thought. Now, had God forgotten about Jesus? No. Had God yet acted to save Jesus from that situation? Not yet. The resurrection happens 3 days later, right? But in the middle of that moment, there's the same tension, right? God has saved, He will save, but right now He's hanging on the cross. He's in the most intense version of that same moment David's having. I mean, the greatest example of feeling like God has left you is Jesus on the cross, bar none. All other examples point to that one. Job points to that. Lamentations points to that. Psalm 13 points to that. Psalm 22 points to that. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Did you have a wave? Yeah.
I did. I was thinking because also when Christ was in the garden
Yes.
and he was in distress.
You've been reading my notes. That was the next one. All right.
Well, I was just thinking because it puts it into perspective as, when we are in distress, we're not sinning, when we're depressed. Or
Excellent
like
point.
Christ wasn't sinning,
Mhm.
he was depressed. And David was not sinning when he was depressed. It's just something that I remind myself if I'm going through something, it's not a sin to feel this way. It's how you react to it, which is what you need to be careful about.
Yeah. Which direction do you turn to? Who do you turn to? Right, for that answer. David prays. I mean, when he's told that the child from Bathsheba would die, I mean, he goes for like a week without food and prays and won't take food and won't wash himself. He just is he sinning in that moment? No, right? Is Jesus sinning in the garden? Is Jesus experiencing a lack of faith in the garden where he prays to the point where he starts sweating out of his sweat pores or bleeding out of his sweat pores? No, he's not. He's doing what people do when they're in distress. And if the cross is the greatest example of someone feeling abandoned by God, example number 2 has to be Jesus in the garden, right? And everything that leads up to the cross is just more of the same, right? same level of intensity. You know, was there a period of Jesus' life where he didn't pray regularly to God? No. Okay, because he's our perfect example in that. And yet he doesn't always do the thing in Gethsemane. We don't read of him earlier in the Gospels praying this way. Right? His prayer went from, you might say, 10 to 11 in the garden, maybe higher than that if you want to go up from there. Yeah, the deeper the distress, the deeper Jesus prayed. And by the way, not the only time. Can you think of another period in Jesus' life where he was in distress and he sought to be alone and he prayed in that context? The garden wasn't the first time.
Temptation.
Well, he's tempted by Satan in the wilderness, right? One can assume he was praying in that context. Mark, or one of the
I was thinking of two. Before he selected the disciples, he went away for a time, and then he was trying to when the news about John's death.
Yeah, I was thinking specifically about when John the Baptist died, when his cousin was beheaded for doing the right thing, right? He tried to go pray, and he's actually prevented from doing so by the disciples first, and then the crowds following him.
And then,
But he saw that was the answer. Go pray in that moment.
of course, then he did, because it's the fourth watch before he's coming to the disciples.
He finally gets rid of everybody, and he's able to go pray, right? The Garden of Gethsemane is not the first time he went through this sort of thing, and you can see that in his life. Okay, other connections. If you've been reading my notes, what's the third one? All right, if you get this one, we're gonna have to talk. What do you think? Other things in the psalm that remind you of something about Jesus. We said one early in class, right? Jesus once described death in some pretty interesting ways.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus was the one, and I think it's the fourth one. He described death as sleep on two different occasions. We talked about the one with Jairus' daughter. Let's look at the other one in John 11, right? This is the one where he really, really sort of highlights this. John 11, you remember this is the death of Lazarus, and beginning there in verse 11, Jesus says, after saying these things, he said to them, Jesus speaks to the disciples, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover." It's like, yeah, he'll wake up, right? Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Right? They didn't get it when he said it the first time, but that's what he meant. Right? He's dead. Same way he described Jairus' daughter. She's not dead, she sleeps. Normal, everyday people can't talk about death that same way. Right? When we say someone's dead, they're not. We don't have an ability to wake them up. Jesus did. He had the ability to walk. He had the ability to talk about a dead person as if they were asleep, because he could undo that, right, at will. And that's what separates him. David fears that he will sleep the sleep of death unless God lights up his eyes. There's a distinction between the darkness of death and the light of God, right? Jesus is described in John 1. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Right, so there's just a theme connection there between the two. The third point up here, just kind of an overall message. David is concerned in Psalm 13 that his enemies are going to be exalted over him in verse 2. And he wants God to answer him, verse 4, "Lest my enemies say, I've prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken." How do you suppose Jesus' own enemies acted when he died? We've won. We've rid ourselves of this upstart. Our position is safe if you're talking about the Pharisees and the scribes, right, and the priests. Dodged a bullet with that guy, But then Sunday morning happened. And all those same people who thought they had prevailed over Jesus realized they didn't, right? And the people who were lamenting Jesus' death were instead the ones who were going to be able to rejoice, right? Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's faithful calling out to God saying, "Don't let the enemy win," and God being faithful to that. And Jesus won, right? He was the ultimate faithful person, and he's able to rejoice over his enemies. One final thing. David describes trusting in God's steadfast love and rejoicing in God's salvation, singing to God because of the way he's dealt with us. Revelation 7 describes God and the Lamb, okay, on the throne in heaven. There's a scene of the throne room there. Revelation 7:9, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude no one could number. They are from every nation. They're wearing white robes. Look at what they say in verse 10. Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. David spoke of, one day I'm going to rejoice because you've saved me. One day God's people will stand before Jesus and rejoice that he saved them. Right? It's just a cool look forward to the future. All right, I'm out of time. Like I said, Sunday, Lord willing, you'll have at least Psalm 14, and if I do everything the way it's supposed to be done, you'll have the rest of the month of June. What month is it? January, to fill in. So it'll be like 14, 15, at least 14, 15, and 16. All right, you'll have the material for that, and if things go well, maybe more. All right, but thank you guys for your comments and for looking at this outside of class. That helps more than you know.